Hi everyone, my name is Tom Pettit and welcome back to another episode of Beyond Come Follow Me. This week in your Come Follow Me lessons, you are going to be studying the doctrine that is found in sections 71 through 75. And here for a few minutes, I'm going to give you the historical context of these sections with some background stories and some things that were going on in the church as well as in Joseph Smith's life and others. And hopefully with that historical background to the sections you're going to be studying, some of these comments from the Lord might pop out and mean a little bit more, and take on a different meaning, understanding what the Lord was referring to and answering to when Joseph was making the inquiries. You know, the challenge with the Doctrine and Covenants is we're jumping in mid-conversation. Joseph is having a situation, he has a question, he takes it to the Lord, and the Lord answers. We have the Lord's answer, but sometimes not knowing what's going on in the church, what's going on in Joseph's life, and particularly or especially the question that Joseph is asking, it brings us in mid-conversation and we just get the answer from the Lord, and so we have to kind of piece it together a little bit. But as we do so, the answer from the Lord can become so relevant in our lives. The Doctrine and Covenants certainly isn't it is historical documents, but it's not for history. It's really living revelations. The Lord declares in section 1 that his church is not only true, but it's a true and living church. And so these words in these sections and all the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants, they're living words, meaning that they're very applicable to ourselves. So hopefully with some historical context, these words can come alive and have some more meaning into your life and into your own personal study. Sections 71 through 75, there's certainly some things going on. 71 and 73 kind of pair together. So I'm going to skip 72 for a second, tell you about 71, what the Lord commands them to do. 73 is the result of what they were commanded to do in 71. So it's all kind of one story. And then I'll bounce back to 72. So here we go with 71. Now in past videos, I've explained about a man by the name of Ezra Booth. Ezra Booth was a strong member of the church, early member of the church there in Kirtland. He had a strong desire. So much so that his name is referred to in several sections of the Doctrine and Covenants. He was called to be one of the first missionaries, one of about 26 that were originally called to go to Missouri. Joseph being one, Hiram being one. A lot of those prominent early church history names that you're familiar with were on this mission to Missouri, and Ezra Booth was there with them. The journey didn't go as hoped for Ezra. Zion wasn't everything he had hoped it would be. The missionary work wasn't as fruitful as he had thought it should be or could have been. And anyway, he came back to Kirtland with some embittered feelings, which drove him right out of the church. He started publishing some articles in a local newspaper slandering the prophet. I went into great detail about that story, but that's just a very brief summary to bring us to 71. Because now with these newspaper articles being published, there's some concern among the members of the church, but it's also slowing down the work or the progress of the work, the gathering of Israel that the missionaries are trying to perform here in the Ohio area, where this newspaper was locally being published. And so Joseph goes to the Lord and says, what do we do about Ezra Booth in this situation? And the initial response I think that I would have is you fight fire with fire. Ezra's coming at him with some slanderous material. Let's stand up and let's get back and fight back, and let's stand and put down these slanderous rumors. But that's not the Lord's way. The Lord instead tells Joseph to just preach truth. And don't necessarily come head on with Ezra. Although Sidney Rigdon, in his zeal, he challenged Ezra Booth to a public debate. Ezra declined, knowing how good Sidney was in public discourse and how smart he was, and certainly he would have also known that Sidney had truth on his side. So although Sidney was zealous to go out and stand toe-to-toe with Ezra and prove Ezra wrong, the Lord says, no, that's not our way to do it. What we're going to do instead is just preach truth. And those seekers of truth will be able to discern between right and wrong. And that was a topic that I had in last week's video. about discernment in the light of Christ. Well, so here we are. The Lord says, no, just preach. So we put the Bible translation on hold. Joseph and Sydney go on a mission locally, and they're preaching the gospel. And Joseph would later one day say, and I don't know if he was referring specifically to this incident with Ezra, but probably not. He's probably speaking generally, because this happened over and over through Joseph's life. And what Joseph explained is that light always stirs up darkness. And whenever light is introduced and someone is obtaining light and knowledge from the Holy Ghost, that's when the adversary comes in and tries to disrupt that light. And the light disrupts darkness, is what Joseph said. And so we're going to fight this fire with light instead of a retaliation. Let's go to verse 9. Verily, thus saith the Lord unto you, there is no weapon that is formed against you which shall prosper. Meaning Ezra Booth can go to the newspapers, he can do all that he can to bring this church down, and that form of a weapon, it doesn't stand a chance against the word of the Lord. Truth will always prevail. And so it takes us now to section 73. So in 71, the Lord says, go and preach the gospel. And then in 73, we find out the results. And it was good results. In fact, so much so that Joseph and Sydney are brought in from doing that preaching and return to focusing their full-time attention on the translation of the Bible. And so in 73, we see that the Lord calls them home, and now is going to send additional missionaries out to continue this great work of spreading the gospel. In verse 2, and then, behold, it shall be made known unto them by the voice of this conference their several missions. So those in attendance are going to receive mission calls. And that was the cool thing with some of these conferences, is Joseph would stand up and he would start to speak the mind, the will of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord, so and so, you're called on a mission, you leave on this date, you're going to this destination. And oftentimes, every time, because we didn't have 18 and 19-year-old young men and young women going off on missions. These were men in their 20s and 30s who had wives, or a wife, and had children. And they were called right there at the conference. Hey, at the end of this conference, go home and pack, and you're leaving. And we don't know when your return date's going to be. Such was the case with John Murdoch. John Murdoch was called on several missions, and soon after his wife died, I'm going to refer to this story a little bit later, but I'm jumping the gun here. But John Murdoch was one of these missionaries who was called on a mission. He had 3 kids under the age of 6. His wife had just passed away, and yet he went and served. And he was gone for over a year on that particular mission. Well, here in section 73, I keep jumping ahead of myself to stories that I'm going to get into detail later. But then here in verse 3, now verily I say unto my servants Joseph Jr. and Sidney Rigdon, saith the Lord, it is expedient to translate again. That translation being the of the Bible. And so coming from the mission field, we're going to send others out in your place, and it's time for you to get back to what you're doing. And then in verse 6, I love this, and I'm going to give a little bit of history on this. Now, I give no more unto you at this time. Gird up your loins and be sober. Even so, amen. Gird up your loins. We hear that in church history, and we don't use that today. That's a Hebrew reference. And from the church website, it gives a definition. By an individual provides a definition of gird up your loins, but it's right there on the church's website. It says, in biblical language, to gird up your loins is to prepare for a journey or for work. The Hebrews wore girdles or sashes when traveling and when at work. On such occasions, they would gird their clothes about them by tucking them under the sash to ensure free movement of the limbs. The servants of the Lord must be prepared to do his work and to go when he calls. So gird up your loins. So these Hebrews would have their robes on, the common dress of the day. And when it was time to get to work, you needed free movement of your arms and your legs, because you're either going on a journey or or because there's work, physical work to be had. So you'd wrap up all that loose material and you tuck it into your sash, and now you're free to move or to fight if you have to, or to work in the field. And so gird up your loins is a reference to that. So you think of the Come Ye Saints hymn. Gird up your loins, fresh courage take. Our God will never us forsake. So the promise, our God will never us forsake, comes in response to our action. Gird up your loins, fresh courage take. And I don't wear a robe. I don't know if you wear a robe, but when you're out and about doing your daily thing, but when it's time to get to work, the ancient Hebrews would gird up those loins, and symbolically or figuratively, we can do the same. Where we nowadays we say we roll up our sleeves and get to work. Back then we'd gird up our loins and get to work. So we roll up our sleeves, we gird up our loins, whatever it is, but it's time to get to work. The Lord needs workers, those who have faith, hope, charity, and love with an eye single to the glory of God, those who have faith and desires to serve God are called to the work. And so as we are working alongside with the Lord, that's how we're rolling up our sleeves or girding up our loins. And then as we do so, the promise that William Clayton gave in the Pioneer Anthem of Come Ye Saints, as we do so, then our God will never us forsake. In fact, there's another phrase that the pioneers would say to each other to encourage each other. Not only gird up your loins, fresh courage take, but they'd also, a common phrase that they would share with each other when the times were tough was, the Lord helps those who help themselves. That doesn't mean that the Lord leaves us alone and says, hey, let's see how you do here, and then I'll step in at the end. No, it says, hey, we can't just sit around and ask the Lord to bail us out and to help us without putting forth some effort of our own. As President Nelson says, and I often say in these videos, the Lord loves effort. There was that conference talk, I think it was President Uchtdorf, who talked about how he gave an analogy of riding a horse-drawn wagon, and if that wagon gets stuck in the mud, we can't just sit there in the wagon and say, hey Lord, I've been obedient, I've kept the commandments, I pray, I read my scriptures, I do my ministering assignments, I do everything that you've asked me to do, and so I'm stuck in the mud, so I'm just going to sit here and send your angels or what have you to help get me out of here. And President Uchtdorf, he explains, that's not the way the Lord works. You pray for help to get out of that mud, but you got to get out of the cart and start pushing. And so this is what we do. We gird up our loins, he says. The Lord gives us that command. Okay, let's go back to 72 now, and we'll go back into our order. And here in 72, you read in the section heading that during this conference, Joseph received several of these revelations, including Revelation 72, and within 72, Newell K. Whitney is called as bishop. Now we have a bishop. It's Edward Partridge. He was the first bishop called in this dispensation. But he's serving as bishop down in Missouri. He's overseeing, as a bishop does, the temporal affairs of the church as it's growing and being established in Missouri, over 900 miles away. The Lord needed a bishop in Kirtland to be doing the same. And so he calls Newell K. Whitney. Now, in section 68, the Lord revealed some of the duties of a bishop, almost as a precursor, almost as hey, this is what's supposed to be, what a bishop's supposed to do. And now here we get a few sections later, and now he's extending the call to Newell K. Whitney. Did Newell have the words of section 68 prior to his calling? I don't know. Was he in the room when Joseph received section 68 to hear and maybe have a spiritual insight that this was a responsibility that would become his? Excuse me. I don't know that either. But we do know that when Joseph would receive revelation, it was personal, and yet it wasn't private. There would often be people in the room, many people at times, when Joseph would receive revelations. Sidney Rigdon described it once that he was standing in the upstairs room of the John Johnson home, and he would look out the window, just gaze out the window, and he would dictate the revelation, and Sidney would write it. Sidney would write down what Joseph said. He would read back to Joseph what was written. If it was correct, Joseph would continue dictating the revelation, and others would be in the room watching this process. So was Newell K. Whitney around when Section 68 was received? I don't know. Was he around when Section 72 was received and his name was given? I don't know that either. But how would it be to be watching the prophet, if he were in the room, to be watching the prophet dictate this revelation with power and authority? What a spiritual experience. And then to hear the words, and now verily I say unto you, my servant Newell K. Whitney, and now verily I say unto you, my servant Newell K. Whitney is the man who shall be appointed and ordained unto this power, or the office of bishop. Now, whether Newell heard that live or he read it later, he was having a conversation with Joseph after this revelation was received. And he says to Joseph, I do not see a bishop in me. He had doubts of his ability. He was hesitant. Could I really do what was revealed in Section 68? What Edward Partridge is currently doing that I've seen him do? Can I do that? It's like when we go to the bishop's office and receive a calling, when we walk out and we're on our way to the car out in the parking lot and we're thinking, serious? Can this be for real? Can I really do this? And Joseph's response to Newell's inquiry is the way that our bishop or stake president or member of a bishopric could respond to our same inquiry. Really? Are you serious? Are you sure? Does the Lord really think I'm up for this? So with all that personal commentary there, opinionated commentary, let me go back to the actual history. Newell says, I do not see a bishop in myself. And Joseph's response is, you do not need to take my word for it. Go and inquire of the Lord for yourself. In other words, the revelation was given. I know, Joseph's saying, I know that you're to be the bishop. But don't just trust me. Go and find out for yourself. And this is a real pivotal time. Because in all the revelations up to this point, it's the individuals coming to Joseph and saying, Joseph, what does the Lord want me to do? And Joseph says, I'll pray about it and get an answer for you. Whereas now here, Joseph is saying, yeah, I received revelation, but you know what, Newell? You go get your own revelation. And that's really the pattern that the Lord has established for each of us today, to hear Him, to get our own revelation. Yeah, the Lord will direct the affairs of His church through those He has called and provided keys to receive revelation for the stewardships which they have. And let me make a little side note. Revelation is given to those who have stewardship responsibilities who don't hold priesthood keys, such as a Relief Society president, who can receive revelation on behalf of the Relief Society, and she could be inspired to help and counsel and teach those women of the Relief Society. And so I was mistaken when I said that those who hold keys. But then there's also the point where key holders, such as a bishop or a stake president or the president of the church, can receive revelation for the stewardships which they have. Anyway, I keep running my mouth in different directions. But that's a wonderful lesson. I don't see a bishop in myself. Don't take my word for it, Newell. Go and inquire of the Lord. Get your own revelation. And Joseph is not saying go get your own revelation because he's tired of getting revelation for others, but this is now a pattern that we're going to see moving forward in the church history, and even in today's church, in our own personal lives and families, that we're encouraged, in fact commanded, to hear Him and to get our own revelation. Verse 10, and then I'm going to explain what's behind me here. In verse 10, Newell K. Whitney is given an assignment that in his store, the Newell K. Whitney store there in Kirtland, to keep the Lord's storehouse, to receive the funds of the church in this part of the vineyard, to take an account of the elders as before has been commanded, and to administer to their wants, who shall pay for that which they have received, inasmuch as they have wherewith to pay. What's the Lord talking about? He uses the word, the Lord's storehouse. We call it today the bishop's storehouse. And Newell K. Whitney was to establish a storehouse. That's what's pictured behind me. This little room in the Newell K. Whitney store in Kirtland, Ohio, was the first bishop's storehouse in the entire world, in this dispensation. And in this little room, people would donate, like their fast offerings, like we do today. But they would donate and give of their excess substance. They would bring in wheat and barley and grains, those sorts of things, but also material and equipment, tools. Maybe they'd even bring animals. And it would all come here to the storehouse. And then Bishop Whitney would take inventory of what he had and what the saints needed, and he would distribute right out of this room to those saints who stood in need or in want. And he would provide all these donated goods to help take care of them. Now, through this revelation, it also talks about certificates, and don't think that's something of the past. We, as you read and it says you have certificates and do this with this certificate and bring this certificate and whatnot. 17, a certificate from a judge or bishop, etc. And the Lord uses that regularly. And as you read through section 72, you'll see in context how the Lord's using the certificate, what it's used for, and whatnot. But you can apply that to our daily lives because we have certificates today. We have temple recommends, which is a certificate of worthiness. And right now, with the temples closed, the prophet has encouraged us to keep our temple recommend current. Not because we need it to enter the house of the Lord, because right now we can't. We're starting to. But for many months, we couldn't use it. So why would we need it? Why would we even want it? Because it's a certificate, as explained in 72, a certificate of worthiness, a certificate of who we are. And who we are, it translates into what we represent. And that's standing as a disciple of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so that certificate, that temple recommend that we hold, it's so much more than just a piece of paper to get us back past the recommend desk. It's a standard of truth, is what it is. And that we can hold, and not to display publicly, but as a tangible physical reminder of the worthiness that we have, the worthiness that we strive for, the individual that we're trying to become. It can be a physical, tangible reminder of the covenants that we've made in the temple. And so that we call it a temple recommend because we're recommended to go to the temple. But in all reality and in the definition here as explained in section 72, a temple recommend is truly a certificate of those things as well. We also use other certificates. There's a formal form that can be filled out when you're a member of one ward but performing an ordinance such as a baptism or a confirmation or a baby blessing in a different ward. You can take that certificate, which is signed by your bishop, present it to the bishop of the ward in which you're performing the ordinance in, and that can be accepted, and that bishop, not knowing you but having that certificate in hand, can then authorize that ordinance to move forward and take place. Perhaps more often than not, that certificate is not used, but rather a temple recommend is often shown. Not often, it should be shown to that bishop of the ward in which you're performing the ordinance if you're not a member of that ward. And so that's all that talk of certificate. We still do that today. Newell K. Whitney, just a very brief background. And what I need to do is do a whole hour-long video on Newell K. Whitney to give you a lot of things, a lot of stories about him. But just for today, the sake of today's video, let me just give you a little bit of background about Newell and kind of and how he ended up. And it'll just be a half minute here or so. But before Joseph came to Kirtland, in fact, before those 4 original missionaries came to Kirtland, Newell and his wife, Elizabeth Ann, were seeking for the truth. They couldn't find it. They were looking from church to church, and they knew that the complete gospel of Jesus Christ, as taught in the New Testament, it just wasn't available to them. They were praying one night, and Elizabeth records, one night, it was about midnight, as my husband and I were at our house in Kirtland, we were praying to the Father to be shown the way. The Spirit rested upon us, and a cloud overshadowed the house. It was as though we were out of doors. The house passed away from our vision. We were not conscious of anything but the presence of the Spirit and the cloud that was over us. We were wrapped in the cloud. A solemn awe pervaded us. We saw the cloud and felt the Spirit of the Lord. Then we heard a voice out of the cloud saying, "Prepare to receive the word of the Lord, for it is coming." At this we marveled greatly, but from that moment we knew that the word of the Lord was coming to Kirtland. This experience was significant for the Whitneys because now they knew that the Lord was sending truth and they were going to be watching for it. It's also significant that Joseph saw the Whitneys kneeling in prayer, having this experience. He saw it in vision while he was over in New York. And so on February 4th, 1831, in a horse-drawn sleigh, when Joseph and Emma arrived in front of the Newell K. Whitney store, the outside of the room that you see behind me, Joseph walks through the door. He reaches across the counter, takes Newell K. Whitney by the hand, says, "Newell K. Whitney, thou art the man." Newell says, "You have the advantage of me, for I cannot call you by name, as you have done to me." Joseph says, "I'm Joseph the prophet. You've prayed me here," right? You've prayed me here, as I just quoted from Elizabeth Ann's journal. "You've prayed me here. Now what will you have with me?" And with that, Newell calls to his wife. She comes in. They both meet and greet the prophet and Emma. And Newell and his wife are the first in Kirtland to meet the prophet. Newell stays faithful. He's that bishop, a good bishop there in Kirtland. He follows the saints to Missouri, then to Nauvoo. He follows the saints to Utah, where he's called to be a bishop again in Salt Lake City. And he would end up passing away of an illness in 1850. Of course, faithful and true to his testimony. Okay, that takes us to section 74. Now, in section 74, it's not done in Kirtland. In fact, it's totally out of chronological order. You'll see the date here, 1830. Go back up to 73. It's January 32. We're bumping back 2 years, and we're not even in Kirtland. We're in Wayne County, New York. Now, that's where Joseph was living, or his parents were living at this time, and he was visiting his parents up there at this what's referred to today as the Smith family farm. Not far from the house, I would guess 100 yards, not even 100 yards, due west from where this revelation was received is the Sacred Grove. But I wanted to show you a couple of things here in section 74. Section 74, we get down, and you can read the chapter heading and you'll get an idea of what's going on here. And in section 7, it's talking about baptism, and now we're starting to get baptisms in the church, and that's why this revelation was received. It's some clarification about a verse in 1 Corinthians and about children baptisms. And we find ourselves at verse 7, and here's where I want to give you a little bit of history. In verse 7 of section 74, the Lord's been talking about baptisms. He's talking about the need to not baptize little children. And he says, "But little children are holy, being sanctified through the atonement of Jesus Christ." And this is what the scriptures mean. So the Lord clarifies, little children are clean. If they die before the age of accountability, they're saved without baptism. In fact, Joseph would translate in the Book of Mormon that great doctrine from doctrinal statement from Mormon to his son Moroni about how baptizing little children is an abomination before God, because the whole have no need of a physician. They're pure before the Lord, and if they pass away before that age of accountability, which is revealed here to be age 8, then they're saved in the kingdom. It makes me think of Article of Faith number 2, because what was going on in these days and throughout history until it was revealed as part of the restoration is little infants would be baptized. And if children weren't baptized, it was taught, which is not true, but it was taught that they would be consigned to hell for all of eternity. And who is to blame? The child can't even talk, can't walk, can't make those sorts of decisions for themselves. So who's to be accountable for the damnation of the child? The parents. This is what's being taught in the Christian world, of course, not in our church. And it makes me think of, before it makes me think. So section 74, verse 7 clarifies that, but then years later, Joseph would continue to clarify this when he would write 13 points of doctrine, which would become known as the Articles of Faith. Article of Faith number 2, we believe that a man must be punished for his own sins and not for Adam's transgression. So we can't blame the parents. So why is the child going not to heaven? Because the parents are making the decision not to baptize them. That's the Christian of the day thought. Christian thought of the day. But now the Lord is revealing, hey, everyone's responsible for their own sins. We're not going to punish you for somebody else's sins. And you little children are perfect and pure. You can't make decisions yet. You can't choose. There's no choice given to you to make. So why are we putting the burden on that infant? And so it's all just clarified here. Now this is a doctrine that I don't need to teach. It's so clear and understood and accepted. But as far as the history, that's a little bit of history, a little bit more of the history behind it. I can't imagine the peace and comfort and joy and hope that was brought into the lives of Joseph and Emma when this doctrine is revealed. While living in harmony, during the translation of the Book of Mormon, Emma gave birth to a child. Joseph's older brother Alvin had passed away. Alvin was Joseph's hero, and so they named this little baby boy Alvin. And this little baby only lived a couple of hours before passing away, and is buried still, currently buried near the home that the Smiths were living in Harmony, Pennsylvania. What a tragedy. How tragic. Joseph had lost his older brother. The preacher at his brother's funeral preached the doctrine, as I was explaining it, that was common among the Christian denominations. Alvin wasn't baptized. This is the older brother, Alvin. Wasn't baptized. He's consigned to hell, where he'll be for all of eternity. And so now Joseph, he loses his own son, who's named Alvin. And how that must have been a tormenting experience. Horrific for he and Emma, until this revelation, until the doctrine was clarified on what happens to those little babies. Now, section 74, that wouldn't have been news to Joseph because he had translated that discourse that Mormon gave in the Book of Mormon, and so he would have understood. Emma and Joseph also would lose other children. This doctrine meant a lot to them, I'm sure. While in Kirtland, Emma gave birth to twins, and those twins only lasted a few hours until they passed away. Another grieving moment in the lives of Joseph and Emma. John Murdoch, on the very same day that Joseph and Emma lost their twins, the very same day, John Murdoch and his wife, she gave birth to twins in Kirtland as well. The twins survived, but Sister Murdoch did not. John Murdoch had these these infant twins that were just born. He also had 3 other children under the age of 6. So now he's a father of 5, the oldest child being 6 years old. It was agreed that Joseph and Emma would raise those 2 twins for John. And so they took those 2 twins in as their own and raised them as their own. Julia and Joseph were their names. And about 10 months later, they're living in the Johnson home in Hiram, Ohio, and a mob comes into the house to take out Joseph and to tar and feather him. A story I'll tell when it's relevant to the revelations we're sharing. But as Joseph is taken out of the house, the door's left open, it's wintertime, that cold air comes in and affects the baby Joseph, and he gets pneumonia and passes away. So here's Joseph and Emma burying another child. Boy, they must have been clinging tightly to this doctrine of what happens to children who pass away in their infancy. Section 75 now, and you'll read in the section heading that they're at a conference. Joseph was sustained and ordained president of the high priesthood. Now, this was prior to the first presidency. Was it somewhat symbolic? Probably, because in Fayette on April 6, 1830, he had been sustained as first elder of the church, Oliver Cowdery being sustained as second elder of the church. Now he's being sustained as president of the high priesthood. And then it wouldn't be too much longer when the first presidency would be formally organized, and Joseph would have a couple of counselors to serve with him in that presidency. Leading up to this conference, Joseph gives some commentary. or rather about this conference. Joseph records in the history of the church, a few days before this conference was to commence in Amherst, which is a little city in Ohio, I started with the elders that lived in my own vicinity and arrived in good time. At this conference, much harmony prevailed, and considerable business was done to advance the kingdom and promulgate the gospel to the inhabitants of the surrounding county. The elders seemed anxious for me to inquire of the Lord, that they might know his will, or learn what would be most pleasing to him for them to do, in order to bring men to a sense of their condition. For, as it was written, all men have gone out of their way, so that none doeth good, no, not one. I inquired and received the following. We see this as a pattern, and it's a common pattern that we're going through right now, where Joseph's at a conference, he receives a revelation. That's kind of the section heading for the last 10 revelations we've studied. Joseph's at a conference, he receives a revelation. Haven't you ever been to a sacrament meeting or a state conference, or certainly during a general conference session, where you just get filled with the Spirit and you want to be a part of it? You want to be a part of the work. You want to jump in full force and just be fired up and part of the work, and do everything that the church leaders are telling us to do, the things that the Lord's telling us to do. I remember as a missionary, we would go to zone conference every 4 to 6 weeks. And it was a time where we'd sit in the chapel and we'd listen to my wonderful mission president and his wife, and they would just talk of the good things of the gospel. And we would get so fired up that we almost wanted to skip lunch in the cultural hall and just run out the door and just start preaching the gospel and just talking to people, and it just kind of gets you motivated and gets you going. And I think I believe that's what's happening here. So many of these sections start with Joseph's at a conference, he gets a revelation. Joseph's at a conference, he gets a revelation. Well, Joseph's at a conference preaching these things, and the people in the room get so fired up and they want to be a part of the gospel, and they want to be anxiously engaged, that they're like, Joseph, don't close this conference until you give us an assignment. And so an assignment's given, as it was in section 75. Now, as you go through section 75, you'll see some instruction. There's a lot of individuals' names that are given, people who are in the conference, and and Joseph says, hey, you go and do this, you go and do this, you go and do this. Well, one of those individuals was Samuel H. Smith, the younger brother of Joseph. And I want to just make mention of a story that you might be familiar with, but reading the actual recorded dialogue, it's fascinating and it's thrilling. This experience that Samuel had, not on this mission that he was called to in 1832, but I'm going to take you back to his first mission back in 1830. Now, Samuel Smith has an awesome history. He was asleep in bed in September 1823 when Joseph had his conversations through the night with the angel Moroni. The next day, Joseph reveals to his parents and his siblings that there was a resurrected being in the room last night. He talked to me the whole night. He was super bright, full of light, and he and I, we didn't whisper, we just talked to each other just normally. And this is what I did for 8 or 10 hours through the night. And what's Samuel's response? It's the same as William's and Hiram's and Sophronia's and Catherine's and Joseph Sr.'s and Lucy Mack's. And that response was, we believe you, Joseph. Now here Samuel has an opportunity to say, Joseph, what are you talking about? I was laying in the bed. I was there all night. I didn't see a light. I didn't hear a voice. A resurrected being sent from the presence of God who called you by name and said you have a great work to do. Certainly I would have heard that. But no, Samuel didn't doubt. He said, if you say it happened, Joseph, even though I was there and didn't see a thing, I believe you. And so Samuel had a strong testimony. But he doubted his testimony, at least momentarily. He went to Harmony to visit his brother, who was working on the translation of the Book of Mormon with Oliver Cowdery in May of 1829. May 15th, 1829, Joseph and Oliver received the priesthood, the Aaronic priesthood, under the hand of John the Baptist, and are commanded to go into the Susquehanna River and get baptized. That happened on the 15th. Samuel would make several visits to Harmony, Pennsylvania to help out his brother. He'd work on the farm to free up his brother's time to translate. So Samuel, although he's not credited with the work of translation. The work of translation happened because of Samuel. Because Samuel would come down and help take care of the chores and do the work around the house so that Joseph could be focused on the translation. Samuel had that kind of testimony, and yet he wondered if he had a strong testimony and the faith to move mountains. And so during this visit, about he would end up being baptized on the 25th. So sometime between the 15th of May and the 25th of May, so those 10 days, Samuel arrived, and Joseph talks to him about what happened. John the Baptist showed up. He gave us power and authority, just like it says here in the Book of Mormon, 3rd Nephi, chapter 11. And we got baptized. We're the first people to be baptized with proper authority in this dispensation. And Samuel, he's thinking this is great. And so Joseph invites Samuel to be baptized himself in the Susquehanna River, just a few days after Joseph and Oliver had been. And Samuel says, I don't think I have the faith to do so. Now, I just told you the history of Samuel. All that happened in Palmyra, and he walks 140 miles regularly to come down and help on the farm so that the work of translation can go forward. Does Samuel have a testimony? Of course he does. Does he have faith? Absolutely he does. But he doubted for a minute. Not his testimony, but the strength of that testimony. And so he says, no, Joseph, I don't think I'll be baptized because I don't have the faith to do so. Joseph, the wise older brother, says, Samuel, go and pray about it and get your own answer. So Samuel retreats to the woods there in Harmony near Joseph's home. He prays. He comes out of the woods with a simple testimony and a very straightforward response to Joseph's inquiry about, would you like to be baptized? He says this very simply to his brother. Why did I doubt what I always knew to be true? And with that, older brother Joseph takes the younger brother Samuel into the Susquehanna River and baptizes him. He's called on a mission right after the organization of the church, less than a year later. And he takes a knapsack, we'd call it a backpack or a little satchel or whatever, full of copies of the Book of Mormon. And he has a horrible experience. His first day in the mission field, he walks 25 miles, talks to 4 people, they all reject him. He goes and knocks on the door, which is common in the day, and says, hey, it's getting late at night, it's starting to get dark, I'm traveling, I'm tired and I'm hungry, can I come in and sleep and will you feed me dinner? That was common in that day, and so he did that. The woman says, who are you and what business do you have? He tells her who she is, or who he is, and that he's a missionary with the restored gospel message. And she throws him out and says, no, you can't stay here, which was incredibly uncommon during the day. So that first night as a missionary, after walking 25 miles, he sleeps under an apple tree in the pouring rain. He gets up the next day and he continues to walk, he continues to preach, doesn't have any success. Or so he thinks. He walks into an inn, the Tomlinson Inn, and he sees a man in the back corner, and the Spirit prompts him to go and share his testimony in the Book of Mormon with that man. And this is how it goes, as it's recorded. Now that man in the back corner, his name was Phineas. His last name happened to be Young, Phineas Young. Samuel approaches him, book in hand. The young man, meaning Samuel, said to Phineas, there is a book, sir, I wish you to read. Boy, let's skip the small talk. No need for introductions here. Let's get right down to business. I'm a missionary. I'm proclaiming the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm a representative of him. Here's a book. We're just gonna get right to it. There's a book, sir, I wish you to read. Phineas says, pray, sir, what book have you? The Book of Mormon, or, as it is called by some, the Golden Bible. Ah, then it purports to be a revelation, Phineas asks. The young man opened the book to the testimonies of the 3 and the 8 witnesses and said, here is the testimony of the witnesses to the truth of the book. Phineas read their testimonies. When Phineas looked up from his reading, the young man said, meaning Samuel, if you will read this book with a prayerful heart and ask God to give you a witness, you will know the truth of the work. Phineas promised to read the book. Then he asked the young man's name. My name is Samuel H. Smith. Phineas had seen that name. Ah, you are one of the 8 witnesses. "Yes," said Samuel, "I know the book is a revelation from God translated by the power of the Holy Ghost, and that my brother, Joseph Smith Jr., is a prophet, seer, and revelator." After arriving home, Phineas told his wife, "I have got a book here called the Book of Mormon, and it is said to be a revelation, and I wish to read it and make myself acquainted with its errors so that I could expose it to the truth." He did read the Book of Mormon twice in 2 weeks and would testify that it's true. He didn't find any errors on it, but when he went to his Methodist congregation, the congregation asked him for the opinion. And, quote, he defended it for 10 minutes when suddenly, can you imagine? He's never been to a church meeting, one of our church meetings. He's just read the Book of Mormon twice, and he stands up and boldly testifies of its truthfulness for 10 minutes. He defended it for 10 minutes when suddenly the Spirit of God came upon him with such force that in a marvelous manner he spoke at great length on the importance of it. He closed by telling the people that he believed the book. Now there's more to this story. Samuel would also give a book to a man by the name of John Green, who would give it to his wife. His wife happened to be the sister of Brigham Young. Phineas now has a copy of the book. He knows it's true. Between one or both, they share it with Brigham Young. He takes 2 years to read the Book of Mormon to discover that it's true. And through it all, the Young family became members of the church, but also their friends and relatives, the Kimballs, including Heber C. Kimball, would become members of the church as well. And so from Samuel Smith's efforts, following the Spirit, well, first, he had to gird up his loins, right? First, fresh courage take. He worked hard, and in response to his hard work, the Lord blessed him. Our God will never us forsake. And he says, now, you've worked hard. You've learned how to follow the Spirit. Hear him. Listen. Go talk and preach. Share your testimony to that man in that corner. And because of that, the Kimballs and the Youngs, who would provide leadership to the church for the next 40 years and be somewhat responsible for help introducing thousands and thousands of members to the church, they were baptized because Samuel had the guts and the courage, fresh courage he took to follow that prompting and go speak to Phineas. Section 71 through 75. I hope you've enjoyed the historical background. You're going to love the doctrine. I didn't get into the doctrine, but as you dive into it, you're going to find that it's pleasing, and it's quite it can be quite personal as you relate these things to yourself. I've enjoyed sharing the stories with you, and I hope you have a wonderful week as you study the doctrines that are contained in section 71 through 75. Next week, we've only got one section, section 76. And the history behind 76 is immense. Not just a lot, but it's great history that led up to section 76. But unlike what I do with most of these revelations, I'm going to tell you the after story. What happened after section 76 was revealed. And what I usually don't do is I'm going to actually dive in deep into the doctrine of section 76. I usually leave that to yourself. But it ties in so much so with the history of what's going on in the Christian world and what's going to happen with the church moving forward. I can't tell the history stories without diving deeply into the doctrine, and it's so relevant, and it mirrors what President Nelson is asking us to do today. So I'm really looking forward to section 76, but that's going to be for next week. This week, enjoy 71 through 75, and I'll look forward to another video with you soon.